Right, there you go, recording. Right, welcome everybody to this first post-summer Labour Free European Future event. It's great to be back and great to see everybody and great to start with such an esteemed panel as well. So we've got, as you'll see, we've got three people on the panel today, so some of whom, probably all of whom, will be familiar to you. So Jude Kirton-Darling, of course, is an old and wonderful friend of ours, former Labour MEP, and those were good days, maybe they'll come back, and currently Deputy General Secretary of Industrial Europe. And I'm sure that Jude can tell us a little bit about that as we go. And then we've got Michael Hindley, another former Labour MEP, currently retired, I think I'm right in saying. And then we've got David Henig with us as well, who is of the European Centre for International Political Economy and the UK Trade Forum, and certainly, in my experience, is one of the leading trade voices and one of the leading, kind of certainly on Twitter voices in terms of explaining what's going on with trade post Brexit and our sorry experience with all the stuff that's happening. But he's also, of course, very good, as I'm sure the others are as well, at proposing sensible solutions that are realistic in the context that we're in. So we'll follow the usual format. We'll have Jude speak first, followed by David, followed by Michael. We'll have time at the end for Q&A. You can, of course, pose questions to me using the chat function, better directly than posting it in the regular chat so that I can find it. And you can also ask questions yourself come the end. The best way to do that is to raise your hand using the reactions tab. So without further ado, we all know that there have been major problems created both in goods and services by Brexit. My own view is that they're so bad that they're not sustainable, and that at some point, probably a post-Boris Johnson government will begin to start knitting things together, and hopefully that will be a Labour government. But I'd love to hear from Jude, given her wide experience, kind of where things are right now, how bad it really is, and where we go from here. So Jude, over to you.
Thanks very much, Mike, and thanks very much for the invitation to be part of this. So, as you said in your very nice introduction, I'm currently Deputy General Secretary of Industrial Europe, which is a European Trade Union Federation of manufacturing, energy and mining workers across 38 European countries, and including the UK trade unions in the sectors as well. And to be fair, Brexit has, leaving the European Parliament at the end of January last year, I hoped that I wouldn't have to talk about Brexit or deal with Brexit for as long as possible, but inevitably in the sectors that we organise members in, the whole Brexit deal has and the Brexit talks have dominated a lot of our time. And my kind of feeling is that whereas this time last year, all of the focus was on the scare story of no deal, and any deal was better than no deal. I think that many of us have recognised that the emperor has been naked for a long time, and increasingly it feels like the Johnson-Frost Brexit deal, which was negotiated and concluded at Christmas, is kind of being exposed for the shambles that it's created. And that's because the Brexit trade deal, which was concluded at the end of the year and came into effect with very, very minimal parliamentary scrutiny, is the first trade deal in history to build barriers to trade and to increase red tape rather than to find ways of reducing administrative burden and reduce trade barriers. And it all comes back to that basic ideological decision to interpret Brexit as an exit from the single market and the customs union. And much of the debate on what the step forward is also comes back to that a decision to define Brexit in that way. So the deal that we have on the table makes it already there has been a lot of damage in terms of trade and economic relations, employment and so on. But we also have to recognise that the more that we diverge from the EU, the larger the damage will be in the long term. And while the deal talks about level playing field, and this is a bit nerdy, but it's important language, while the deal talks about level playing field and non-regression clauses, it's primarily designed for divergence and for the UK to move away. And there are big implications from that, because whilst for takeout industrial goods, it may be quota and tariff free, the administrative cost, or in trade jargon, the non-tariff barriers, have enormous costs for many industries. And within our membership, if we think about the chemicals industry as one, the British, the best named industry association, the CIA, the Chemical Industries Association, estimate that the cost of Brexit red tape is about £1 billion to British chemicals industry. This is colossal cost on just one sector. And if you replicate that across the economy, looking at other areas of goods trade, then the costs are quite considerable. Never mind talking about the fishing and the seafood industries, which have been extremely hard hit by the deal. But if you look at trade and services, where the UK excels, and it's always funny when I'm on a panel with David, because he'll probably talk about it, but he used to have a different hat in the past. And when I was an MEP and he was a civil servant, we would talk about EU trade deals and meet in the context of talking with ministers about the importance to the UK economy of services. And yet the trade deal does very little for our service sectors. And it's here that we've seen really the massive amount of impacts, relocations of operations, lost opportunities, difficulties for those who are providing services cross borders, and gaping holes where EU nationals once worked in our economy. So the impact is starting to become clearer. It's quite stark in trade statistics, despite the cloak of COVID. And there are some initiatives being undertaken that I think Labour should piggyback on. For example, I really like the Digby-Jones Index, which is being compiled by citizen journalists in Yorkshire bylines, where they're collecting examples of every restructuring or every announcement involving damage as a result of the Brexit deal. You can't, and we find that in the trade union movement, it's very difficult to differentiate the impact of Brexit from the impact of other things going on, COVID, globalization, lots of other reasons which impact on corporate decisions. But they've collected something close to 260 examples of job impacts as a result of Brexit. And they call it the Digby-Jones Index because Digby-Jones, Lord Digby-Jones, I should say, announced in the referendum that Brexit would have no impact on jobs at all. So I think there are some things where we can use and be much more vocal on. That's the visible impact in terms of jobs. There's a much more difficult impact in terms of lost investment, things that just didn't happen as a result of Brexit. And what we're seeing is right across our membership, certainly, that's the case. And one very concrete example to give you is in the northeast of England, we have a new rail a production site, Hitachi at Newton Aycliffe. The site was opened when I was an MEP. I was at the opening. I saw its topping off. I saw its opening as a site. It's one site in an industrial park where there were meant to be two other factories alongside the first factory. And when asked where those factories were, the chair of the Northeast Chamber of Commerce said, well, you'll have to go to Italy to see where the other factories are, because the choices of investment were just made to go elsewhere where it was easier. And that's the lost chance. So my last word, Mike, because I know I'm not meant to blather on. It was last night, Emily Thornberry, Labour's Shadow Secretary for International Trade, published a new paper on Labour, the proposal for Labour's trade policy in the future. Understandably, lots of it is focused on trade with non-EU member states and countries, non-EU trading partners. And the policy is called Labour's trade policy, putting workers first. And it's very inspired by the kind of policies that actually we were pushing as Labour MEPs in the European Parliament when we were scrutinising European trade policy. Greater parliamentary scrutiny, greater transparency, binding labour rights and enforcement of labour rights and environmental standards. But there's one reference in it which I picked up on, which was in relation to the UK-EU Trade Cooperation Agreement. And what the paper says is that Labour will fix the holes in the EU-UK TCA, in particular looking to remove, one, the barriers to EU workers filling staff shortages in UK public services, two, non-tariff barriers affecting UK businesses, and three, the twin threat of UK divergence from workers' rights and the resulting threat of EU use of rebalancing mechanisms. Now, this for me is tinkering. This is tinkering. And we should be honest that this is tinkering, because if we're honest about the impact of Brexit on our economy, then as the cloak of COVID is removed, Labour has to be far more assertive. And for me, that means making the hard Brexiteers own their own deeds, talking about the Digby-Jones index, making the case to rejoin the single market and the customs union, because they are the only way to deal with the economic and employment impacts, negative impacts of Brexit, addressing the fundamental weaknesses that we have in UK labour rights, which ensure that we really put workers and jobs first. And we're talking about job quality in the UK, and we're not putting sticking plasters, trying to avoid very difficult subject and alienate a part of the voter base who may actually respond if we're honest about the impact of Brexit, and may positively respond to an honest debate about it. I'll stop there. Thanks, Mike.
Brilliant. Thank you, Jude. That was really insightful, as I expected it would be. So thank you. David, we'll come straight across to you.
Thank you, Mike. I'm not going to take a Labour specific position here, and I'm afraid I'm not going to take a position on whether Labour should be campaigning for single market or customs union or hardest Brexit possible or whatever. I'm just going to lay out really what a sensible trade policy should be from the point of view of a left-leaning political party, and that's quite tricky, because I always suspect that nobody really goes into the Labour Party or equivalent parties in across Europe because they're really focused on trade. Trade is associated with being a conservative issue. No, I don't think it should be, and I'm going to come on to this. But that's the reality. We do find it a little bit uncomfortable sometimes, talking about trade. There's quite an irony with the whole EU argument, is that those free traders, they call themselves free traders, who proclaimed their love of free trade and how important it was, are now contorting themselves to say that actually being in the EU wasn't free trade. That was nothing to do with free trade, and it's a protectionist racket. And of course, that's nonsense. But that's what they're having. That's what they're having to say. And meanwhile, people who perhaps didn't really talk about trade very much on the left are saying you've just put up the barriers. Well, what's the truth in this? A couple of things here. One, trade barriers have gone up dramatically, and the impact is as we see. This is what you would expect. All orthodox economic theory would say if you put up trade barriers dramatically in the way the UK has done, you will lose out. You'll lose out in trade, you'll lose out in investment, as Jude said, and is often forgotten about investment. That is exactly what is happening. So it isn't going well at all. It's not just the decision for the ultra hard Brexit. It's a sort of general purpose denial across the UK government that in March 2019 and subsequently since, we were going to be ready for a no deal Brexit, but we read today we still haven't actually got our own border processes in place, when we don't know whether they'll be ready in time to introduce them at the end of this month. And we're having to do a trade deal with Australia, with climate change deniers in effect, to try to show the benefits of Brexit. So that's not going well. But on the other hand, and this is where I would probably diverge from many of you, I don't see that the UK will be rejoining the EU anytime soon. And if we do, it'll be under different circumstances. I think even it would be very difficult to even rejoin the single market or the customs union, though I think it would be, it's not impossible. I think we need a trade policy that suits the UK right now. If it comes to a point where there is the political will to rejoin the EU or the single market, whatever we put in place now will not in fact be that much of an obstacle. But I just don't think you can kind of, if you like, retrace 5 years ago. I think you've got to look at now. And the way I would look at it now is that trade is a powerful instrument. People want access to the UK market or the EU market, and that access can be incentivized to create the kind of to incentivize the kind of conditions we want, for example, on climate change or workers' rights. And that, I think, is broadly the direction that global trade is going in. And that's a sort of a slight rebalancing, perhaps, from where it was, not a dramatic one. So in no great order of how I would see future, the way we should look at trade, see it as a good thing in general. In principle, it should be good for workers who get to sell the goods they produce globally. It should be good for consumers, and it should be good for the UK. We're good at lots of stuff that we need to sell, but it isn't. It has implications as well, and therefore we should balance regulation and trade in all areas. We should be thinking, when we're regulating, what's the impact on trade? What's the impact on, well, as we already do, what's the impact on workers or the environment? Make sure that realistic decisions are taken with the information available. One of the big issues with a hard Brexit is that there was never any evidence base. In fact, the government refused to publish any evidence base. I think Labour should be saying, we demand on all these decisions an evidence base. What will be the impact on UK workers of putting up these trade barriers? What will be the impact of changing these regulations?
There is the Brexit impact reports do actually say that. David, pardon the interruption. They give us all of that.
Yeah, can we refrain from interrupting? Sorry.
Just, but yeah, but I think there's things that Labour can be pushing for. Have high standards. I think that most of the best exemplars in the world of trade policy, countries like New Zealand, see that the best way to trade is to have high standards in food, in labour, regulation, climate change, so that you meet all the standards that everybody else puts in place. There will be areas where actually we would want to be different to the EU. The EU standards are not always necessarily the best. There are some quite questionable things in, for example, in food. I also think that in terms of data, I don't think the EU has the right balance between data flows and data privacy. So there may be areas the UK can diverge, but we would do it with care and towards the higher standards, not lower standards. I already mentioned about using our access to our market as an incentive for good behaviour, and that's why the Australia trade deal was such a disappointment. I think in terms of boosting relations with Europe, but also protecting our own manufacturing sector, the most important thing we can do is to rejoin appropriate European regulatory agencies like the European Aircraft Safety Agency and our chemicals. We've already stayed in the technical standards structures. Leaving those, imposing extra costs on UK manufacturers will hit investment, and it will hit UK production, and that will hit in turn UK jobs. We should make a huge priority about trust. International trade relies on trust these days, the trust that we'll meet the regulations, that we are high standard. David Frost is burning up trust with the EU at a rapid rate, and I think we burn it up with other countries as well. That's not going to help us. Every headline in the Express may be you know, is all become a bit of a cliche here. But in Europe, or frankly around the world, it's just seen as, well, the UK is not really a serious international player. Try to go further on services. I think sometimes we don't believe how good we are at services. What are these services that we sell internationally? University, BBC, arts, culture, film production. There's so much of this. Actually, an awful lot of which the government is currently attacking. Also, the Home Office and visa policy is a continual problem for services. We should be making these a priority and saying, no, we should be proud of our services production. It may mean in some cases that we also seek to, if you like, upgrade the status of some of our services. I think the transport and distribution, which we're also pretty good at, is seen as a low status employment. Manufacturing would be better. It doesn't need to be like that. That's the sort of the badge we put on it. Carbon border adjustment mechanism, complex title for something that we should do. The EU has proposed that you would potentially charge extra to take account of carbon pricing for imports that from countries that don't have such schemes. That, I think, is something we should do. The EU has a proposal. I expect the US will follow in some way. We should be making a clear commitment on that as well. Engaging grown-up diplomacy, fairly obvious, I think. Not get too excited by either new innovation or old manufacturing. A successful country like the UK needs to be good at a whole range of things, to import and export a whole range of things. And that's what we should aim to do. We shouldn't aim to be necessarily self-sufficient, but equally we should aim to produce what we can, import the rest. I think that we can be too simplistic on this. Don't expect too much from the WTO, I'm afraid. There's not much happening at a multilateral level. I don't expect it to start. China, I'm just running through various issues we need to think about. China, I think we should attempt to keep a business dialogue going with China, but be clear about our political lines of what we won't accept. It's never going to be an easy relationship, but I don't think the UK should be cutting off other countries because the US says so. I don't think we should be seeing trade as excessively neoliberal or hyper-globalization as the current fashionable theories go. What we have globally is regulated trade, and we should aim to be on the right side of that, of making it high quality trade. And I think overall, we shouldn't actually be going on so much about Brexit. We should be talking about government incompetence and what a competent government would be doing. And a competent government would be protecting our business in Europe as it would around the world. And that, I think, is the path to resetting this debate. We do have to move on from 2016, difficult though that is for many people. So my summary would be, take the world and the UK as it is now and work with that. Make trade work, and try to reset the narrative. Trade can be helpful to achieving wider Labour Party goals, and if that leads towards a closer relationship with Europe, well, it probably would, because most trade is ultimately regional. But there is a tendency to make trade all about other things other than trade. We don't want to, like climate change or workers' rights. They're important, but trade is also good in its own, can be good in its own right. So we want to have high quality trade. We want to encourage high quality trade, and we want to encourage those who participate in it. The Conservatives have left that space open for you. So those are just some thoughts. Sorry, they weren't awfully well structured, but hopefully others will help to put them in some sort of shape, and hope they're helpful.
All very helpful and very well structured, and thank you. And I think you're right. Actually, I think this. I don't know anybody off the top of my head who got into Labour Party politics because they were passionate about trade. Maybe Jude does. I don't know. But you're right. It is, of course, it's important. I think one of the things that Brexit has highlighted to all of us is just how important it is in terms of a foundational building block of our economy. So thank you, David. That was brilliant. And last but very much not least, Michael, will come across to you. with decades of experience, of course, given Michael's experience in the European Parliament and I'm sure elsewhere as well, and a very valued member of Labour for European Future. So, Michael, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. First of all, greetings to all friends I see in the audience. I notice Veronica and Richard and David Blackman there. Yes, just one word in support of what's been said already, and that is the importance of our relationship with the EU. The EU will remain our largest trading partner for the next decade. So it's important that we improve upon the miserable agreement that unfortunately Labour signed up to, that Johnson had negotiated. So it is important at some stage that we get ourselves a little more sorted out with the EU between rejoining, which I think is a non-starter, but also embracing the Brexit is a non-starter as far as I'm concerned. Let me concentrate on just a couple of points and very quickly. Don't forget that we have no experience in this country since we joined the European configuration in the early 70s of making trade policy. Trade was something that we handed over collectively to the EU in the early 70s. And that means that Labour and the whole political establishment within Britain has not really concerned itself with trade policy. It's been something done by mandarins, and we developed expertise, including that contribution from David, but the political parties and political process and Labour's never really come to terms with formulating Labour policy. Now we have that task because we are in Tory terms independent and will make our own policy. From now on, Labour in Parliament and in the country will be reacting to trade deals which have been done by the Conservative government. So I'd like to say just a few words about that. First of all, trade policy formulation is a mystical art in this country. It must be made fully democratized, accountable, scrutinized. We've begun to, on the fringes, we discuss this kind of thing, but the European Parliament, as my fellow former members will tell you, actually can ratify a trade agreement. So I'd like to see Labour demanding that any trade deal that the government draws up comes not only before parliamentary scrutiny, but comes before a parliamentary ratification. That means that Labour has to advocate a more inclusive, consensus-based formulation of that policy. Other countries, the EU, Canada, for example, have sophisticated mechanisms that draw what you might call social partners, the trade unions, CBIs, and NGOs into the consultation process. And then that negotiation must be subjected, as it is in the European Parliament, to ongoing parliamentary scrutiny. And then finally, that trade agreement must be actually ratified. Those are things mainly in the interest of democracy, but are things that Labour should be demanding now. Excuse me. Let me say then something about what's going on with the present agreements. None of these agreements are, in fact, new. They are what's called rollovers, which means that the UK, with permission of the other country, Japan, Australia, etc., simply takes on the EU commitments. The other side can tinker with those and make new demands. And this is a very important point here politically, because the bargaining power that the EU had and we have through the EU is essentially access to our markets. The EU can offer a market of 500 million, the EU can offer a market of 60 million. So that changes completely the balance in the negotiations. That's very important to remember, that we have given away a large part of our bargaining. The EU will get a better deal, and a better deal for Britain with Australia or the USA because of the size of its market, then Britain will actually get a loan. The other thing I want to broaden out is the points that were made by the other night by Emily and have been repeated by Jude, and that is what should be in them. Now, in the 80s, both the USA and the EU supported the idea of conditionality in trade agreement. All EU trade agreements contain conditionality on human rights. A treaty can be reviewed, can be in fact turned over because of infractions on human rights. The first example was one with Argentina, which said if Argentina slipped back into dictatorial power, then the EU would review and possibly renege its agreement. This has also come up in effect with Burma, possibly with Russia concerning the Crimea. So this is something that's important for Labour to stress. Also, social rights. The EU always demanded basic ILO, International Labour Organization standards. The Tories, as Jude has indicated, will try to drop this. This is important that Labour keeps up that demand, that social rights are important. Countries have a right to use wage differentials as part of their advantage in trading, but they do not have the right and should not have the right to suppress the mechanisms which allow wages to be negotiated in those countries. They cannot suppress the rights of association because those infractions of social rights, of course, are infractions on fair trade. And the other one which has come about in recent decades is the commitment to environmental change, climate change, and so on. It's noticeable that Liz Truss has had to admit that they do not wish to sign up to what is common in many countries' trade agreements and the EU trade agreements on having a commitment to climate change and the introduction of the continuation of the Paris dialogue. Those are things basic that Labour should now be asking for, and Labour should be insisting on. We'll lose the vote, but Labour should say that that's how we will trade. Now, if there's one thing, I'll not repeat what David was saying, if there's one thing I find that Labour people are interested in is somehow a fairer trading system that particularly is committed to rebalancing, redistributing the wealth in the world. And that means our relations with developing countries. I think David is right in saying that the World Trade Organization is struggling, but it is multilateral. The world is drifting more and more into bilateral deals, and any bilateral deals puts the whip hand in the power of the biggest traders, the EU and the USA. The WTO is multilateral, and we must commit ourselves to multilateral trade rules, which allow smaller countries to also have their say. In the 90s, we started having a dialogue about development rounds in world trade talks. This was blocked by the USA and the EU didn't push it. But this is important that we keep that development commitment. The rules are fairly good in favor of developing countries. The key point about this is capacity. Many countries don't have the capacity to trade. The West and Britain under Labour must be more accommodating to the general idea that the value added of many of our raw materials stays in the developing country. The old example, Europe is the biggest producer of coffee, the biggest drinker of coffee, and produces no coffee. All the value added goes into the marketing, the laboring, the grinding of the coffee, and so on. We have to shift that kind of debate. So we have to have practical aid. The other point is if we want the developing world to be able to join in this multilateral framework, it has to have the capacity to do it. Many of the countries who we set standards for, ILO, environment, human rights, do not have the capacity to enact those measures. And they rightly are suspicious that some of these measures are in fact to protect our own market. So if we want, and Jude's quite right, if we want to improve world standards, we have to help those countries develop the capacity to do it. We're cutting back in this country on health and safety inspectors. We're cutting back in this country on environmental standards. And yet we're imposing or suggesting we should impose these standards on developing countries. You can go through whole areas of Africa and there's not one industrial health and safety inspector. You can go through whole areas of Central Asia and Africa where there's not the capacity to pass the necessary health tests that we put on food imports, which would boost their income. So we have to develop much more wide-ranging discussion about what trade is and what Labour would do to shift trade to the same domestic demands we make, and that is to bring about fundamental shifts in the balance of economic power. That's what trade should be part of. It all too easily becomes a rather arcane discussion on language by the insiders. I'd like us to concentrate much more on this broader vision of what Labour is going to do. For the moment, it will have to set its own standards so that we would eventually have a different programme to the Tories in simply saying trade is a good thing and free trade is a good thing, but we'd somehow like to help the rest of the world. I hope I've said enough to indicate my own thoughts, and I gladly respond and then enlarge on some of the points, and I look forward to the discussion. Thanks so far.
Brilliant. Thank you, Michael, and thanks again, David and Jude. That was all. They were all really helpful contributions. So as ever, if you have questions, you can either put them in the chat, either to me directly or to everyone. Easier for me to spot them if they come to me directly. Otherwise, you can raise your hand using the reactions tab. So a couple of people have done that already. So we will come first to Dan McCurry, who's joined us. Always good to see Dan. So Dan, go ahead.
Yeah, I think I just wanted to really respond to David Henig's point about we should have a concept of values for our world trade and be pragmatic about the fact that we've gone so far down the path of leaving the European Union that it's actually quite difficult to make the point of rejoining. I mean, I think really the problem here is that, I mean, I know some people think of me as a bit of a zealot wanting to rejoin the European Union, but the thing is, I think the real problem is that the Labour Party in Parliament and so forth lacks zealotry, and that's why we're in this position. If you look at the moment with Liz Truss, her office has a huge queue going down the street of foreign delegations coming to do trade deals. None of it is about values other than the Tories wanting not to lose face. They want to be able to boast of trade deals, and they will sell British fishermen down the river, they will sell farmers down the river, they will screw over industry as long as they can say we've got a trade deal. And everyone in the world knows that, and everyone in the world who walks in to meet a British delegation or British ministers, they don't see people who are strong, who are going to do a good deal or who have a purpose. They just see a great big fog and stench of desperation because British are desperate to do trade deals. And that's the problem at the moment. So I just feel as if the notion that the Labour Party should hammer to kind of push for a values-based trade deal with the world is really problematic for me when we've got a situation at the moment where we're just so weak that even to discuss values is being rather lost. And that's my real position is that we just need a bit more zealotry You know, that's really my view. Thanks.
Jude, Michael, David, does anyone want to respond to that one?
Yeah, I'll have a go. I've nothing against zealotry. What are you being zealous? What are you being zealous for? And I think the point is that you've got companies that are suffering now because of the trade barriers. So be zealous about the stuff that is actually happening, and have your solutions around that. I think that's that. You now have, and I think Jude started this. You now actually have real life case studies. Now I don't know how related it is to what's happened in the last year, but somewhere that Jude would have known. Cleveland Bridge, I think, was a company, a steel company that went out that filed for whatever it is, bankruptcy over the week in the last few days. Now there are these are real businesses that are being affected by the choices that this government made. I'll put it like that, because that's the point that you can make. Don't look as if you want to, you want to relitigate 2016 over and over again, because there's real stuff going on here. Be zealous about the real stuff, because there's plenty to go for. What I was trying to give an illustration of is there is plenty to choose from here to build a case around, whatever the case is you want to be building. So get to it. I don't think there's any reason to be to hold back. Just build it wisely.
Jude?
I mean, David, Cleveland Bridge make bridges. It kind of does what it says on the tin. I think one thing that you said, David, which I thought is really good, because part of this is about telling the story and the political narrative. And I agree, Dan, that there needs to be a kind of much more, I wouldn't say zealous, I would say a passion in this debate. But I think you can be passionate about, and I really liked your phrase, David, that you can be passionate about competent government. And I think that identifying, the way that, for example, the citizen journalists at Yorkshire Bylines have been kind of cataloguing what's going on in different industries and different companies would allow the Labour front bench to actually be extremely vocal and concrete in kind of making an argument about competent government, which demonstrate it, but which put the responsibility for what's going on really on the shoulders of those who advocated this route. And that's not about replaying 2016, which I don't advocate, but that's about talking about the absolutely enormous damage which is being done to our economy today, and the need to start to address that damage. I'm for competent zealotry. I guess that would be my conclusion.
Brilliant. I agree with all of that. Michael, did you want to comment?
Only briefly. You see, it's also a question of who makes the rules. The rules of trade have to be made as wide as possible in their formulation, and that's why I agree with David's, shall we say, despair about the WTO. But you cannot allow world trade to now be dominated by bilateral agreements between the major blocs, which others must follow. There's nothing wrong with ethical trade and ethical foreign policy, but you can't run a trading policy based on us all eating fair trade products. And that's why I bring in and I repeat the question of capacity building. It's as simple as that. We are not only forcing, sometimes with goodwill on the Labour side, human rights is fairly simple. You shouldn't shoot people in public. That's clear. That's an abrogation of human rights. But Labour standards, environmental standards, good. But developing countries are very suspicious of saying, hang on a minute, you weren't obeying these rules until very recently, and now you're imposing them on us. So we have to work out being much more generous and practical in helping other countries trade, if we really want to address the issue of development in the rest of the world, which I think we should do, and we should do as Labour people. So that's what I mean. And that's not impractical, that's just being sensible. It's not going to make up the deficit that we are losing with the EU, but it is something practical we shall concern ourselves with. There's no attention paid to the idea of who is making the rules. And if it isn't going to be multilateralism, if it isn't through the agencies of the UN has agencies dealing with trade, if it isn't done consensually, the gap between rich and poor in the world will continue to grow. It's as simple as that.
Great, thank you so much. David Taylor-Gooby, if he's off, it looks like he's on the phone. So Guy will come to you, and then I'll come to David Taylor-Gooby afterwards.
Okay, firstly, apologies for interrupting earlier. Okay.
No problem.
Thank you very much for the various comments that have been made. I mean, Michael's point, I think, was very interesting, where he says basically we are like a baby in arms when it comes to negotiating trade deals. Government in this country traditionally has found that difficult. The EU's been much better at it. So we don't have the... Also, to Jude's point that, you know, we're seeing visible wreckage. Right now, what we are looking at is Brexit affecting everybody. Up until now, we heard about the fishermen, we heard about the car industry, we heard about jobs in the city, but if you didn't have to work in that particular sector, you didn't notice too much. Right now, everybody can see it. Now, what I'm concerned about is, let's face it, all of us here wish we hadn't left. We think it's a bad idea and it's obviously doing some damage. What I don't get is why last year, Keir Starmer, on a European ticket, wiped out Boris's 20-point lead in 6 months. Well, the Tories were rumbling about getting rid of him. Then he changed stance. I'm not negating he had to whip to support the deal. It was better to have a deal than no deal, yes. But he shouldn't have changed his stance because it's cost us now. We're now lagging 7 or 8 points behind the Conservatives. On a pro-European ticket, we wiped them out. Nobody wants this rubbish anymore. You know, the Brexit argument has transparently collapsed. And what I don't understand is why we're sort of playing a Vichy France and sort of passively accepting something that we don't need to accept. We could negotiate our way back in. The people at the top of the EU have said we can, and I'm sure they would. Having a non-aligned Britain isn't helping anybody, least of all us. Sorry, just wanted to say that piece. That's all. I'll shut up now.
No, you're very welcome. Thanks for contributing. Anybody? Jude, Michael, David, would you like to respond? Michael, go ahead.
Yeah, let me just make 2 points, not to be controversial. This notion that Britain isn't good at trade, I thought I'd explained. It's not had to do trade since we joined the EU. There's some extremely good, influential decision maker persuaders who are British, who have a tremendous influence on EU trade policy. Trade policy would not be as open and would be more protectionist if the Brits hadn't been there. That's one. Secondly, of course, Britain was very good at trade. Blackburn, my hometown, was the world's biggest producer of cotton goods, although not 1 ounce of cotton was grown. And that was because Britain made up the rules under which countries traded. And they suppressed the Indian textile market, and the Royal Navy imposed on recalcitrant countries and markets its trading system. So we have been very good. The problem with the British is that we think, this is Johnson's myth, which is largely followed, unfortunately, sections of the Labour Party, that we can regain our preeminence in trade without the Royal Navy and without suppressing other markets. And that's why I'd like us to make a much more step change in how we think about ourselves in Britain and the world. We no longer do what I'd like to get back to as doing that through Europe, but it's not on the agenda. What we have to do is think what a Labour position is going to be over the next couple of years when we are, as it were, on our own. But please don't pass this idea that we're not good at trade. Some of us have 10, 20, 30 years experience of negotiating, scrutinizing and voting on trade agreements, and the EU, and there are lots of good Brits around. probably all be snapped up by private consultancies as trade advisors now. But we have an awful lot of talent who know an awful lot about trade. Labour has to tap into that much more than it is doing.
True points. We are very capable of that. I mean, I've been in international trade myself for 40 years, which is one of the reasons I feel strongly about it as well as rights. Anyway, thank you for that.
David, Jude, any thoughts?
Well, I actually don't buy that. You know, we couldn't have done trade deals ourselves. Plenty enough expertise around. Fact is, we're just smaller than the EU, and that's politically awkward for anybody to admit, evidently. But we're, you know, ultimately, I think there's a lot of mystique around these around trade deals. There's some sort of secret to them, and you can be terribly wonderful at it. There's no great evidence. You work out what it is you want, and then you see what it is you can pay for it with. And I'm afraid we don't have that much to pay for it with. Now, you can avoid rookie errors like giving Australia everything they wanted and getting nothing in return, but ultimately it shouldn't be that difficult. Actually, I think we talk too much anyway about trade deals. I don't think trade deals are it's not only the multilateral that the world is moving away from, it's actually the bilateral as well. We're actually moving into, I think, a place of more unilateral action, which is sort of extraterritorial. The US has long done that. The EU wants to go further with it as well. China is putting on sanctions which are WTO dubious at best. It's actually going to be a pretty tricky world for us to work out what we're going to do with it. But actually, I think I wouldn't worry too much about the trade deals. It's more about how are we going to look after ourselves in this world of strong countries, and starting by not obviously upsetting them all is quite a good start.
Well, we upset virtually everybody when we left. A lot of people have pulled investment out of here, and of course, you know, we aren't part of a big block anymore. But anyway, okay, thank you.
Jude.
Yeah, maybe just to rather than to repeat, come back to the point that is now an opportunity in view of the fact that the damage is visible for everybody, and I think I see politics also about the courage to speak out and to try and lead. I guess that's the thing, not to always be cowed and following what you perceive to be what voters think. And I think at the moment there is an opportunity, because of the chaos caused by Brexit, to actually change the narrative if we're brave enough to do it. And I think that will open up a lot of alternatives which potentially aren't obviously on the table at the moment, because it is about the narrative. And I think, I mean, it's just a perception. Maybe I'm completely deluded, but I think people are getting frustrated by this government and how incompetent they are over, not just in relation to Brexit, but across a whole range of issues. And if you look at some of the polling, actually in, for example, red wall seats, which are blue former Labour seats, I don't know what colour you want to put on them now. Actually, the polls are improving for us. So I don't understand why we don't take that opportunity to try and shift the dial in a way, and to move the window of debate more onto a territory that we can put forward proposals in a proactive way. I pretty much agree with everything that Michael and David have said. I would just like say, having witnessed trade negotiations close to, what strikes me is that we had, before Brexit, we had some absolutely phenomenal civil servants who were active in trade questions, also in the kind of EU framework in trade questions. And what has been striking over the last few years is the exodus from the UK civil service, and the way that ideological positions have had an influence on whether people have been able to progress in the civil service. And I think that's really worrying, because that's long-term change in terms of regardless of which, well, if we come into power as a Labour government, you know, it has bigger implications in terms of that that space for competent zealotry. I'm gonna use that phrase in every meeting now.
Do it. I love it. Brilliant. Thank you all. Right, we've got 3 more questions lined up. We are beginning to run out of time, so if you can make your questions brief-ish, that would be really helpful. But David Taylor-Gooby, you've been waiting for a while, so do go ahead.
Yeah, I apologise. I got an unexpected phone call right in the middle of that. Just a very, very simple question, I think, and is what we can actually put forward at the next election. I mean, Jude said we've got to lead, and I totally agree with that, but we've got to lead in a direction of going back to the EU. Doesn't mean we'll necessarily get there by the next election. So I just wondered whether it is realistic to propose, which is what I've been saying all over the place, that a much more conciliatory approach to the EU by a different government would secure a lot of the problems that we've currently got in trade, like what's happening to small companies that export food. I read somewhere that it's gone down by 50%, you know, because of all the difficulties of small shipments going over in lorries, having to be unloaded, checked, and all the rest of it. They don't bother. So it's getting rid of these sort of problems, and the public would notice that, getting rid of some of the problems in the supply chain, and the public would notice that. How realistic is it to promise that without necessarily we're going to rejoin the EU, but we're going to negotiate them in a much fairer spirit?
Jude, you want to take that one first?
Yeah, I think the Tories have burnt a lot of bridges in Brussels, but I don't think the UK as a country has burnt bridges in Brussels in the same way. And I actually think that if there was a change in government and there was a change in the tone and the attitude of relations, then things become possible. And I also think I advocated, you know, we rejoin the single market and the customs union. I don't think you can do that from one day to the next day. I think it would have to be on the basis of rebuilding trust. So you would take some steps which address some of the problems. You could also, for example, address problems in the services sector by having agreements on professional qualifications, which would address lots of issues related to business and professional services. And in that way, you start to rebuild those bridges. But my perception in Brussels, and I can see Richard's got his hand up, so he's pretty well placed to talk about this as well, is that those bridges are not fundamentally damaged. Although the bridges with Tory party, I think, have been well and truly burnt to smithereens.
Great, thank you. Michael, any thoughts?
Yeah.
No, just let other people ask questions.
Okay, great. David, do you want to throw anything in? No? Okay, great, good stuff. In that case, Peter, we'll come to you.
Okay, thank you. Try to keep it brief. I agree with almost everything that's been said, and it's a steady process, but we don't want to get in the position of, as the damage is rolling in, you know, more is worse. That's a Trotskyist position, isn't it? You know, make them suffer and then they'll vote for us. But underlying all of that, there is two factors. First, that the wider public, even amongst the soft leavers, don't understand the European Union at all. They don't know what it is at all. They have been told it's an oppressive bureaucracy, laughing at us, you know, French in silk suits or whatever, laughing at us, etc. We know it's all total nonsense, but that has really stuck. And I was very struck, though, by what made it almost worse, and I think we have to bear the culture and the anthropology and the psychology in mind in what we are talking about. There was a letter by the ex-head of the UCL, I think it was, NHS Trust, who's Dutch and leaving. He said, I've been the head for about 5 years. And what I've noticed is that amongst the English staff, of the medical people, and you know, these people are across the board of nursing and medical, they're not interested in what happens in Germany medically, in their own profession. The Little Englanderism goes very deep. We're special, we're separate. And these are not, you'd imagine, people who are raving Brexiteers. It's a cultural reflex. I think it's deep, I think it exists, and I think we have to address it. trade issues, of course, are quite technical and often technical. And, you know, we can trade on why you, the one thing I think we should do, like Erasmus, and particularly the creative music sector, they've been destroyed. If we could get them to articulate this, why are we being cut out? We cannot tour Europe. Our music is dying. It was one of our great contributions to the world in the last 50 years. I tend to think they've made a massive contribution and change in this country. If we can get them articulating it in a coherent way, not saying vote Labour, but, you know, we've got to rethink this and shift that cultural default, rather lazy setting, I'm afraid. As Ralph Dahrendorf once said, the English are rather indolent. I'm afraid he was right.
Great, thank you, Peter. I'll take Richard's comments, and then I'll go back to each of the panel, and they can deal with both. Go ahead, Richard.
Thanks. It's not unknown in British political history for public opinion to turn completely against something that it initially supported. Think of Suez, for instance. Think of Iraq, for instance. There are other examples. And with the litany of problems and sometimes disasters that are now hitting the headlines every day almost on the consequences of Brexit, this is surely a time to press home the argument that Brexit was a national mistake. We were led into it by the bunch of charlatans that are now running the country on the basis of lies and misinformation, and hammer that message home. There are already signs. A recent opinion poll showed, I think it was only 39% of people still think Brexit was a good idea, 61% don't. So opinion is already moving in that direction. And this is the time to cite all the examples that we've been discussing here and many others to hammer that message home. Because if it becomes received wisdom that this was a mistake, that opens the door, not necessarily for rejoining, but maybe, but at least for arguing for a closer relationship, rebuild those bridges, customs union perhaps, single market, rejoining Erasmus, joining some of the technical agencies, the Air Safety Agency and so on and so forth. That then becomes a much easier thing to do. And maybe we can go the whole way. We don't need to decide that now. All we need to do at the moment is to thoroughly discredit that Brexit decision.
Great, thank you. Right, I'll come to each of you in turn, and then if you could comment on those questions, comments, and then give us some final thoughts as well, and then we'll finish up. But I guess just final question from me, which is, you know, if you were magically leading the Labour Party tomorrow, what would your priority be in not only kind of raising the issue of trade and getting some public interest in it, but I guess also just try to communicate to the public that actually what's happening is serious, and it's serious for, you know, the future of our economy and our country and our place in the world, and propose some solutions that I think, much as I agree with Jude, I think at some point we should be promoting single market and customs union. I think probably at this point that would be a step too far. So solutions that are maybe, you know, a road towards that. So David, if I could come to you first, I'm throwing rather a lot at you in one go, I realise.
Yeah, so I've been made leader and I've immediately resigned because I'm clearly not cut out for that, I'm afraid. So sorry, that wasn't the answer you were looking for.
That's fine.
Look, I just, however you do it, I'm not going to provide any advice or not on campaigning, but I think that there's an issue here about returning a trade discussion, an economic discussion, to some semblance of reality going on. There is no reality in the Conservative Party view on trade. We're going to make up everything we lost to the EU through trade barriers by selling more biscuits to Australia or something like that. Now, as long as that's the general wisdom, doesn't matter what you're advocating for, it fails if that passes as wisdom. So in some way for me, that's what I'm always discussing, is how do you return to reality? I would do it by actually saying, look, here are jobs, here are people's lives being affected, here are people's lives being affected by decisions, and here is how, if you made different decisions. Personally, I would go in this small scale. I wouldn't be talking about, you know, EU membership. I don't think that's happening anytime soon anyway. I would be going the small decisions. If you want to safeguard thousands of jobs of people working, for example, in aircraft manufacture, and it's a huge UK sector, then the UK should be part of this European agency. That is just common sense. Personally, I would be going down that avenue and following that, because I think that is where you now see the jobs that are under threat now, the jobs that are being lost, the impact that it is having. One thing we haven't talked about actually is labor costs, and I think that one thing you're going to hear in a year or two's time is that, thanks to Brexit and thanks to people no longer coming in from Europe, that UK labor, that people have got a pay rise. I think you're going to hear that. So you better have there better be an answer ready for that. And it's all very well saying, well, people, that was not really to do with the decision in 2016. That's going to be what is in people's minds. So I think, you need to have an answer for, actually, we can do trade policy in a better way. We can, look after people, look after their jobs, and we're not going to do that through cutting off from the world. And almost certainly, I suspect there will be higher wages, there'll probably be higher inflation as well. So it probably won't make much difference, but that's the line you're going to hear. So I think I'd be looking at the smaller stuff rather than the bigger rejoin the single market, customs union, etc. But that's your choices as campaigners. I'm not a campaigner. I'm looking at the day-to-day impacts. So I will freely say that it's definitely not my job to be the next leader of the Labour Party or to advise what you should campaign on. I'm just looking from a trade point of view. People's jobs and lives are being affected. I would be finding ways to draw attention to that and what is causing that.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. David, Michael, come to you.
Thanks. Well, first, give myself a bit of that. First of all, I'd say to the Labour Party to take trade seriously in terms of policy and not allow it to be bogged down by experts and technocrats who simply tie you in knots about changes in small degrees in tariff quotas. And they do that certainly by offering generally, but within the Labour Party, having a much more inclusive approach, as I indicated before, to trade policy formation. It is not to be left in an executive capacity, as I once tried to explain to Robin Cook. It is something that should be open as it is to many outside influences where they feel they can feed in and develop policy, and Parliament can scrutinise and ratify trade policy. Second point, I agree with Richard and others that we just have to let 1,000 flowers blossom, keep alive and develop the links that we have. We should never forget that we actually have allies in Europe. Our policy I supported was Remain and Reform. Don't forget we have party allies within Europe who also want to reform. Now, we can't say we'll rejoin when you reform. We have to keep alert and aware and in touch with that reform movement in Europe. We spend little time still, and never did, talking about Europe. We tend to be like the imperialists. We rather address world issues. So keep in touch with our European allies. They're the ones who are going to be wanting to reform. We can match our ideas with them so that when it comes to Labour policy, the big question will be not just rejoin something with which there's genuine objections, but we're rejoining a reformed EU, and we have allies there in that process. So don't forget that. We've not written off Europe. There are friends and allies there, Unfortunately, on the left in British politics, they still seem more excited. In a way, I have sympathy, but they're more excited with the revolutions in Cuba than what is happening in the French Socialist Party or the German SPD, which may be back in power in some form in a couple of months' time. So stay in touch, be European, and be practical.
Brilliant, thank you, Michael. And last but absolutely not least, Jude.
Yeah, well, I think I started off by saying what I think we should be doing. I think we should be assertively trying to shift the narrative and using concrete examples of what's actually happening on the ground to do that. And like I said at the beginning, I think the work on the Digby-Jones Index highlights concrete examples that in every constituency that people can recognize and can see, and alongside the wider impact on HGV drivers and the impact on supply chains, which are increasingly obvious for people. So I think we have to be highlighting what is going wrong. I think David has really hit on something, and it was something that I raised in a different fringe of the TUC Congress yesterday, actually, around the question of working standards. We actually have to be honest, not just about the impact of Brexit, but also about the reality of having a very deregulated labour market in the UK, and honest about what impact that has had on many working people in Britain. And this is actually a moment where, for the broader labour movement, where we could address improving the working conditions in some sectors where the working conditions have really deteriorated. So you can see unions, for example, in the road transport sector, trying to use the leverage of the shortages to improve the working conditions. Obviously, the government are heading in the other direction, trying to deregulate further EU worker protections, but that's then an opportunity for the Labour Party to build an alliance across the kind of broader Labour movement around talking about some of the issues which actually led to the Brexit vote in the first place in 2016, in places like where I come from in Middlesbrough, where people weren't voting to leave the European Union because they really objected with a particular provision in the treaty for the European Union. They were voting to leave the European Union because they saw that they had a vote, and anything which was going to possibly make the situation better or give a bloody nose to the political establishment. That's basically the message that we got on the doorstep. So in some ways, there's a way that we can build a narrative which is about highlighting the damage that Brexit is doing today, together with a more progressive view of what the UK looks like in the future, also addressing working conditions and basic kind of bread and butter issues for the Labour movement broader than the Labour Party. And I think with a bit of imagination, I'm not a comms specialist, but I think there's a campaign in that which would allow the Labour Party to come out really on the front foot, and then to come with an agenda which is about better relations with our neighbours. I think people are embarrassed seeing how the government are behaving in terms of our European neighbours. Many people are embarrassed, and I think that needs to kind of be exposed more. So I guess, yeah, if I by some kind of miracle became a Labour leader tomorrow, that would be some of the agenda that I would be trying to put in place to build up, to ensure that we had the steps to a closer relationship. And as Richard said, those steps potentially lead us back into the European Union. Potentially they lead to a different kind of European integration, a different kind of relationship with other European countries. But at the very least, to try and address the massive economic damage which is being done today, and avoid the international ridicule that we see of Britain in terms of diplomacy and our position on the world stage.
Brilliant. Thank you, Jude, and thank you, Michael and David as well. Great comments and lots of food for thought from all of you. So thank you so much for joining us today. Thanks everybody else for joining as well. Really great to see you all. Really great to be back. If you are in Brighton at Labour Party conference, we're doing a couple of events there. We've got a rally 12:30 on the Sunday in the Odeon, which is right by the main venue, and then on the Monday at 5:30 in St Paul's Church, which is around the corner from the Odeon. We've got a panel with Hilary Benn, Paul Blomfield, Claire Moody and Christabel Cooper on what Labour's Europe policy should be in the next election, because we're going to need one. And who knows when the next election is coming? It could be soon, and who knows? Hopefully, when it arrives, we'll win it. But I think having some coherent policy on this is going to be essential. So if you're able to, do join us then. We'll be back with the next webinar after conference, so probably in about
Where's
a
the
month from now.
recording?
Where is what? Sorry.
Recording
of this, it will be on YouTube, on our YouTube channel. So if you go to YouTube and type in Labour for a European Future, you will find this and all our former events there. And there's quite a lot to catch up on. We've done quite a lot of webinars over the last 18 months. As you might imagine, it's helped fill the time in multiple lockdowns while we've all been stuck at home. But I think they've also been valuable rather than just time fillers. So make use of that. And we did a conference earlier in the year as well, and all of the sessions that were part of the conference are there as well. So thank you so much. Great to see you all.